Live from Nasdaq's global headquarters in Lower Manhattan, welcome to the December 21st edition of Advisory Live, powered by Nasdaq IR Insight. I'm your host, Will Briganti, and joining me today as my guest is Liz Cohen, Executive Vice President and Head of Financial Communications at Weber Shandwick. Liz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here on the program, and we're going to talk today about a study that Weber Shandwick just released that measured sentiment from the buy side on what your team is calling intangible factors that drive investment decisions. So Liz, give us some of the highlights from the survey.
Sure. And I would just step back to talk about the quality of the group of individuals that we surveyed. It was more than 100 individuals that have investment making decision on the buy side from funds with more than 500 million in assets under management, and over half of those were portfolio managers. So very robust sample size. And what we found, of course, going into this, being financial communications practitioners, we would have assumed that certain elements that are not your EPS would be important. Frankly, though, the percentages and the numbers surprised me.
Yeah.
So what we found is that intangibles, meaning not the quarterly financials, not the guidance, not the projections, are very important to these investors. In fact, over 80% assign some value to the intangibles. Within that, the most valuable was quality of management at 89%. And so you ask yourself, how do you measure quality of management? And we'll talk about some of the ways that you can do that. Also very interesting, 67% said the media image of a company is important. So for anyone listening who
brings a smile to my face.
Exactly. It's worth investing in that.
Absolutely. That's great.
We also learned that investors rely on a lot of sources, on average 12. Of course, the first being internal research. Interestingly, the second is the Bloomberg terminal.
Okay.
So we should not underestimate anything that's being pulled into the Bloomberg terminal. And by the way, separately, Bloomberg was listed as the most trusted media source.
Yeah, that's like super fascinating, but I can obviously tell that if you're sitting in front of a product like that, it's likely that you're going to be trusting that source because they aggregate so much news. It's not just the Bloomberg-driven data.
That's right. They're pulling in others. That's exactly right.
Now, one of the key findings that I actually was surprised to see, but was relieved to see, was that buy side are relying on communications that are issued by the company. So not just the media image, but materials like press releases, company presentations on non-deal roadshows or buy side, sell side conferences. Now, what opportunities does this present for IR and communications professionals like us?
Right, exactly. So first I would just give some of the numbers that investors, 75% of them are relying on the company website. So for anyone who thinks that's not important, it is. And similarly, the press release is at 73%, tied with presentations. So the takeaway is we cannot underestimate the basics. It is worth investing in getting the look and feel right, as well as the messaging, because we know from this research that these materials play a direct role in the decisions that investors make.
Yeah. Now, what about social media? How important is that to investors?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting because we're in a world where social media is ubiquitous and everyone is focused on it. I would say, the numbers there were interesting. 70% of investors say they check social media regarding a company. 38% are following senior leaders on social media, which I think makes sense given the current administration and the importance of Twitter today. But we found that many investors are checking social media weekly or less. So I think this is an interesting one to follow when we update this survey. I would expect the number to increase, but I think the takeaway is it is important, but it's not as important as your traditional types of channels like the press releases, website, investor presentation.
Yeah, old school still reigns, but
it does.
My sense is probably they're hunting and gathering using all the sources available, so social is probably right up there.
Yep.
Now, you mentioned quality of management. So how important is it for investors to then have access to the management?
Critically important. 65% say they rely on these one-on-one meetings with management, and we found that investors actually specified they would like access, some type of access to management 7 times a year.
Wow.
With some of that's by phone,
Right.
and at least one time a year in person. So I think this is interesting feedback for investor relations professionals as they plan their IR calendar, and just to make sure that they're getting that one-time face-to-face in. And again, going back to the original point about quality of management being critically important, how do you convey the quality of management? Well, one of those ways is making sure that investors see management and hear from management.
That's terrific insight. And my final question for you, Liz, is are there any specific tactics that an IR communications professional can take to address some of the pain points that you heard from the buy side
Sure.
during the survey?
Sure. Well, I'll start with one that we didn't cover too much, which is, investors are paying attention when there's regulatory scrutiny.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is important for the comms team to work in lockstep with the government relations team. And I would say, given the current administration and what we've seen, that it's critically important at this time. Also, equally important, again, we talked about this, is have a clear plan, both in terms of CEO visibility in the media as well as in your IR calendar, to ensure that CEOs and senior leaders are visible.
Yeah.
Again, in terms of print online, broadcast, as well as directly with investors. And then finally, I would say, as I said before, but this is a key message, get the basics right.
Yeah.
The website, the investor collateral, the press releases, all of those things are critically important, as we know from this research.
Liz, thank you so much for explaining the survey and for being our guest today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Liz Cohen, Executive Vice President and Head of Financial Communications at Weber Shandwick. You can find the survey that we just mentioned on Weber Shandwick's website, and we'll also post the link here at the video on our Twitter page. Thank you so much for joining all of our Nasdaq Advisory Lives this year in 2017. We're going to be off next week, and we'll come back to you starting the week of January 1st. Have a great holiday, and we'll be back to you in January 2018. Thank you so much.